From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Tomoko Steen at Science, Technology, and Business Division. Today's event is, as you mentioned, sponsored by the Asian Division here, and also French Society, and also Science and Technology and Business Division. It's a wonderful cooperation with the Asian Division, and we usually have a much more dry room. This is a very beautiful room we can have the speaker in. So today's speaker, Professor Joanna Lewis, is the associate professor at Georgetown's Science, Technology, Science and Technology and International Affairs at the Georgetown University's Foreign Service Institute. Its official name is Edmund Walsh School of Foreign Service. And her research focus is energy, environment, innovation in China. Some people say that clean energy in China is oxymoron, but it's not actually true. With Dr. Lewis advising, the China is going to be leading the clean energy endeavor, and also Dr. Lewis is leading an NSF project, and it's kind of hard to understand the project name, International Partnerships and Technological Leapfrogging in China's clean energy sectors. And it's leapfrogging, so she's going to explain to you more about this. And also her book, recent book, Green Innovation in China, received the 2014 Harold and Margaret Sprout Award by the International Studies Association for Best Book for the year in environmental studies. I think you all should read it. And also, she was National Academy's committee on the USChina cooperation on electricity from renewables. So this National Academy has many the committees and produce monograph. And if you're interested, I can actually point to you the monograph. She has advised domestic and international agencies, including domestic one is UNIDO and USAID. So she was advisory board to ACOR also, and the US-China program. So she has PhD from the Berkeley and also MA from Berkeley. And I know some of you are actually Berkeley graduate. And before further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Lewis.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming this afternoon, and I'm very appreciative of the invitation to speak with you today, so thank you very much for having me. Today, the title of my talk is China's Role in Global Clean Energy Technology Development. And so I thought I would speak a bit about what is happening generally, both internationally and then domestically in China as relates to clean energy, and particularly how this is influencing the international discussion on climate change and the climate change negotiations in the United Nations. I want to start by mentioning the recent bilateral deal between China and the United States. You may remember last November, the presidents came together for a summit and announced what I think many of us in this field thought was really a groundbreaking deal between the two countries, in that both countries just simultaneously announced the actions that they were going to do to address climate change. And I think this is extremely important, not just for what's happening in both countries domestically, which I'll talk about but particularly for the upcoming climate talks that will be taking place in Paris at the end of this year, where, as you may know, countries are trying to reach a new global agreement on climate change, following on the Kyoto Protocol and the negotiations since then. So the key elements of this announcement, which were particularly notable: the United States, of course, agreed to take on an economy-wide target to reduce its emissions 26 to 28% from 2005 levels by 2025, and to try to do this actually on the more aggressive end. China also, for the first time, announced that it would try to achieve the peaking of CO2 emissions around the year 2030, and to try to peak early, as well as announced a goal to increase the share of non-fossil fuels in primary energy to 20% by 2030. This includes renewable energy as well as nuclear power. And so this announcement was really done with the intention of trying to really motivate other countries as well in the international climate talks. So China's goals from last November have now been enshrined in its pledge that it has submitted to the United Nations in advance of Paris. And so this includes the targets I mentioned, as well as a new what we call carbon intensity target as well. So I think these are quite significant because, of course, this is the first time that China has actually mentioned its emissions would peak. If you study China energy data, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with the statistics, for many years it looked like China's emissions, both its energy consumption and its greenhouse gas emissions, would essentially grow exponentially for the coming decades. And so all the modeling projections coming out of China and the United States and other places essentially just showed an upward slope. It's really just been in the last few years where we've realized that that's not actually the case because of domestic energy trends, which I'll talk a bit about today. And so I think that, you know, the real question is, which I want to focus on, and these are really the topic of my research, how can China transition to a lower carbon economy? And to do that, of course, it does take clean energy technology. So a lot of my work actually looks at how China has acquired clean energy technology. Where is that technology coming from? And whether China is contributing to green innovation. I'll just talk about this briefly today, but that was the topic of my last book. And then finally, I want to end with a bit of discussion about how the United States and China are cooperating and could continue to cooperate on clean energy, and why I think that's important. So I mentioned that in the target, when China announced a peak year for the first time, when we see, this is a study that was done both by researchers at Tsinghua University and MIT here, which shows a very similar peak projection for China. And I show you this to point out that essentially if China's total carbon emissions are to peak in the year 2030, you would essentially have to scale up clean energy extremely substantially. If you can see here on the chart, the yellow bar, the green bar, the purple bar, this is wind, solar, hydropower, natural gas, all are going to have to be scaled up dramatically. And then you see down here on the bottom, the dark blue is coal, and you see coal essentially leveling off and then declining quite rapidly between now and the year 2050. Again, this is not something that many people thought would be possible for China. China still gets about 2/3 of its primary energy from coal and about 80% of electricity. So, as you mentioned earlier, clean energy in China, many people say China's not doing clean energy, but this is, really about where China's going, right, and where it will have to go if it's going to actually achieve this emissions peak. This is a chart just showing you where China's energy has come from over the last few decades, and again, as you can see, coal is just by far the largest share. But I think what has really driven a lot of these sort of changes in diversifying China's energy supply is the desire to become more efficient in how energy is consumed. China actually between 1980 and 2000 approximately was able to quadruple its economy while only doubling energy demand. And this is actually extremely impressive. No other country has been able to achieve that rate of improvement. And so that's the declining line you see sort of after 1980 here on this chart. But if you look at this little blip in the chart where in the early 2000s you actually had energy use growing faster than economic growth for the first time in several decades in China. This actually caught the attention of the leadership because this essentially means that their overall economy was becoming less efficient. This also had to do with a resurgence of heavy industry And as you know, China is trying to move away from heavy industry manufacturing, cement, iron, steel, to more higher value added industries that essentially take less energy to produce the same unit of economic growth. This is better for them overall from an energy security perspective, and this is better for the environment from an emissions perspective. And then, of course, there are many other advantages to reducing coal use. In China, one, of course, for those of you who spent time in China, you know well, is air pollution. Local air pollution is a very big concern, not just for human health. It's one of the leading causes of early mortality in the country. But also, there are concerns about sort of the public becoming less satisfied with the current quality of the air, and this could lead to stability issues, which of course are of top concern for the government. This is actually a paper my student did that looked at on days when the PM 2.5, the particulate levels are very high, people are on Weibo essentially complaining and talking about it, and people are very, very aware of air pollution levels in their day-to-day activities in China. So I want to move to talking about what's happening in clean energy there. So globally, I think it's important to point out clean energy is actually now about a $300 billion a year industry. We used to think of clean energy as this sort of little niche sector with a little bit of money going into it here and there. There's more money on an annual basis now going into so-called clean energy than there is dirty energy. Just because when we look at new capacity that's being built, new power plants, in the United States, for example, almost all the new power plants we're building here are either natural gas, which are fossil plants but cleaner than coal, and then wind power, solar power. In most years, actually wind and solar power growth rates are much faster than they are in gas. And we have not built a new coal plant here in a while. We have not built a new nuclear plant either in a while. China has played a very big role in this investment, and in fact, wind energy in China, where a lot of my research has focused, represents the single largest investment in any clean energy technology that any country around the world has made in the last decade. So that's really, it's quite substantial, just the amount of investment that has gone into growing the wind power sector in China. So while I showed you in the early charts that coal is still a huge share of energy in China, coal is not going away tomorrow, right? And I don't mean to imply that it is. But again, if you look at what's going in annually in terms of new plants, we see this real shift that's taken place in the last few years, where if you go back, about 10 years ago, China was putting in 80, almost 100 new gigawatts of coal plants a year. That's, roughly, you heard the figures, that's like 2 new plants a week, essentially, large coal plants. But those numbers have really slowed down quite a bit. And so China is building much fewer coal plants. There's actually been a lot of media reporting in the last few days. They may put a moratorium on new coal plants. They already have done this in some of the most polluted parts of eastern China. So when you look at, there's still a need for growing electricity supply, and so what's being built, still hydropower, but also wind power, solar power, nuclear power are playing an increasingly important role, and I haven't updated this yet for last year, but you would see this trend continuing and even increasing. So I think it was 2013 was the first year China actually installed more non-fossil capacity than fossil capacity in a single year. So that's a real shift. So I mentioned wind power has been a real success story in China. This is showing you the growth that we've seen just in wind energy over the last decade or so. And you can see that, for a while, the United States and China were sort of neck and neck. China has now installed far more wind turbines than the United States. Although, if you actually look at electricity production coming from these wind turbines, there is some concern that they're operating less efficiently than they could be, mostly due to constraints on the electric grid, which I'll talk about in a moment. And you also, I should mention, there's many companies globally, which is what my book looks at, that in China, which are now manufacturing state-of-the-art wind power technology, selling this technology in China, and exporting it around the world as well. Solar has also been, in more recent years, a really big success story in China. China installed more solar power last year than the rest of the world sort of installed that year, and there soon will have more solar than the United States and many other countries combined. It's really quite dramatic, the growth we're seeing there. Part of this is due to the fact that China has built up a very successful manufacturing industry in solar technology, and so these costs of the technology have come down very dramatically. Costs of solar, I believe it's about 60% cost reduction in the last 5 years. So suddenly, when solar was much too expensive, is what China and many countries believed a few years ago, it's now cost competitive with most of the other technologies they would be looking at. particularly if you look at externality costs as well, like pollution. So there's very aggressive targets to expand all these technologies. I won't go through them in detail. This is showing you different scenarios for how China might scale up different low carbon energy technologies in the coming years, and they're really quite aggressive scenarios that people are looking at. This is one study that I participated in, which was done jointly with the Energy Research Institute of the National Development Reform Commission in China, along with several international experts, and funded by the Energy Foundation, to look at what could a very high penetration scenario of renewable energy look like for China in 2050? Essentially, what would be the maximum scenario? This is more of a visioning study. This isn't necessarily what will happen, right? This is, if China did the best they could do, went sort of changed all models, went beyond all projections, what could they do that could actually be realistic? And they actually showed that China could get to 60% non-fossil sources in total energy and 80% of its electricity generation by 2050. So remember, right now they're at 80% coal. So this would be a very dramatic transformation. And it wouldn't be easy. This is a chart just showing you what this would actually look like on the ground. So you can see, again, coal takes this very steep decline in order to allow the other sources to scale up. You see huge increases in solar, both solar electricity as well as solar for heating, geothermal and other types of renewable energy. And this is what, essentially the trajectory for how wind and solar would have to be scaled extremely rapidly over the next couple decades. I think it's important to think about where would this go in China, right? So for many of you are very familiar with the geography of the country. So actually it's Inner Mongolia is where most of the wind power is being developed in China. If you've been there, there's a lot of sort of flat grasslands, plains, a lot of wind. And it's been an extremely good place for wind development, particularly the eastern part of Inner Mongolia is connected to the same electric grid as Beijing. So this actually is useful for helping feed the power demand of eastern China, northeastern China. But you can see that if you really wanted to get to this really, high scenario of wind, you've got to put wind turbines everywhere. And this is a problem, right? Because there's not a lot of just empty land that's not being used for other things. You can do sort of dual use agriculture and wind with solar as well. This is a possibility. But you can see that essentially if you're going to put wind, particularly throughout the northern part of the country, to some extent in the southern part, and lesser extent in the west, you would need to essentially move this electricity to where the demand is. You can see the same thing for solar. Solar is actually a bigger issue because the best solar resources in China are in the far western part of the country, particularly Xinjiang, Tibet. And you can imagine how challenging it would be if you sort of put a lot of solar farms out there. Then you move that electricity, to Shanghai. This is a, very complex transmission and very inefficient transmission process. And this is talking about solar that would far exceed the power demand even that, would already exist in those provinces, even under a scenario where that economic development would continue and these provinces would grow substantially in the next couple decades. So you would need to essentially put in significant transmission capacity. This is power lines, right? You would have to build extensive infrastructure, around the country. This is costly. This is something China is doing, starting to do, but it's bigger than this. It's also thinking about power markets. Power sector reform is a big issue right now in China. How you think about pricing these technologies, how you incentivize the current large power companies, which are all still state-owned, very powerful companies. The grid companies, very, very powerful company in China, State Grid. They are not as excited about this vision, should I say, of the future, because it implies a very different model from what they're used to and quite a few costs. It is a very different type of power grid when you're integrating, as we call it, intermittent resources, right? The sun is not always shining, the wind's not always blowing, so you have to actually think about how you keep the lights on given these sort of new resources. And there are ways, which we can talk about if you're interested. And then finally, on this scenario, of course, if you switch to this, very cleaner vision of clean energy, you get very dramatic reductions in air pollutants, right? Sulfur dioxide, nitrous oxides. So this would be overall beneficial for health. One other thing that's happening, which could be quite important in China for incentivizing this transition, is the introduction of a so-called cap-and-trade system for carbon dioxide. So, for many years here in the United States, just about a block away, there have been very active debates about whether the United States should put a cap on its emissions and then develop an emissions trading system whereby companies would buy permits, trade permits, do this in the most efficient way possible. The United States actually helped to pioneer this model for sulfur dioxide control in the Northeast. It was extremely successful. This is, for people who study environmental policy, this is believed to be one of the most effective, most cost-effective and environmentally effective environmental regulations we've ever done here. And so the idea is that this could apply to carbon. We're not actually doing that in this country, although a couple states are looking at this, California and a few others. But China has announced they're going to do a national program starting in 2017. And right now they have 7 pilots which are underway, essentially experimenting with this and how it might work. There are policies, and I won't go into this for time in detail, but throughout the different government ministries and agencies in China which support clean energy from a variety of ways. So the Ministry of Science and Technology is supporting research and development in many of the new technologies, which will be important. Other agencies like the National Development Reform Commission, National Energy Commissions help support large demonstration projects, support subsidies to promote these technologies. And these are spread throughout the economy. When you look at innovation coming out of China, this is just showing you US patent applications in clean energy. So this is an imperfect measure, I would say, off the bat of innovation, particularly in China, because this is the US view, not the China view. You can look at these data for the US, for China as well from the State Intellectual Property Office, but this is coming out of the US Patent Office. You see that even in the United States, Chinese innovation, Chinese patenting activities are already starting to show up here in terms of very active inventors filing in the United States for inventions in clean energy, particularly in areas like clean coal, carbon capture technologies. These are all areas where China, if they're not leading now, they may be leading in 5-10 years. So I want to end with just a bit of a discussion about cooperation. I think there's a lot of reasons why it makes sense for countries around the world to cooperate with China on clean energy. Essentially, if we have a lot of things going on politically related to clean energy. There's trade tensions, there's disputes right now in the World Trade Organization surrounding Chinese solar panels, as you may know. I think if you have a more cooperative perspective, that can help to ease these broader political and trade tensions. But from a more technical side, if you're actually collaborating on R&D, there's actually things that the US does do better, there's things China does better, there's things Germany does better in terms of having expertise, having ability to bring things to scale quickly. And so if you are sort of bringing together the best of the scientific and technical bodies of these different countries, you can actually speed the rate of innovation, bring down the cost more quickly. If you can deal with the framework for how you do this. And one of those sticking points does tend to be intellectual property rights. So if I invent something, collaboratively with you, and we're both from different countries, how do we share the output of those innovations? Sounds simple, often it's not, right? And, governments get involved in this. Governments, are a part of the R&D process. Private companies are increasingly important in the clean energy space. But governments can play an important role in helping to facilitate these partnerships, making sure everyone feels comfortable with the playing field, and then the scientists can do their job, right? So I want to mention one model of this that I think is working extremely well. This is something called the USChina Clean Energy Research Center, the CERC. This is something that was established back in November of 2009 when President Obama first entered office, and back when Secretary Chu, the then Secretary of Energy, was the then Secretary of Energy. This is a project that he felt strongly about. It was the first initiative to set up collaborative R&D in clean energy between the US and China on a scale of this nature. This is a huge endeavor. There are, up into the first phase of the project, had over 80 projects happening simultaneously in the US and China. This brings together researchers from multiple universities, multiple national laboratories, private companies, all working side by side on a variety of clean energy technologies, focusing on coal, efficient buildings, and efficient vehicle technology. And what's also quite novel about this is that anyone who decided to join this agreement, so all the labs and governments and companies that are part of this, signed an intellectual property agreement that said, anything that comes out of this will be shared equally among all the researchers, whether they're from the United States or China. So this has been a really interesting model, and one that I'm watching closely. The bilateral relationship has really, I think, picked up steam in the last few months. Last month, in mid-September, there was a Climate Leaders Summit, a US-China Climate Leaders Summit in Los Angeles. You may have heard about. This was actually the first time where a lot of mayors and governors and cities from both countries got involved and took on specific pledges related to climate change. And again, the idea here is that it's great to have the president sort of sign off on these high-level plans and goals, but at the end of the day, it's one thing for Beijing to take on a huge target, and it's another thing for, the mayor of Guangzhou to say, we're going to do this, here in our city, we're going to implement this, and this is what it's going to look like, right? So this is the type of thing that was being discussed at this meeting. And then, of course, we had the state visit just a few weeks ago, where President Xi was here in Washington, and you saw some important things come out of this. This was sort of the last time the presidents were meeting officially before the climate negotiations in Paris, although they'll be meeting informally in the G20 and a few other places. But a few things came out of this. First of all was this public announcement about the trading system, which I mentioned earlier. This was the first time you actually had the president of China say that this is where China was going to do, and so that was a pretty big deal. China also announced, in the context of its broader power sector reforms, that they're going to do something called green power dispatch. This essentially gives priority when you're operating the grid, as I mentioned earlier, where if, instead of dispatching a coal plant first, if it's available, if you have wind power or solar power also ready to be fed into the grid and power the city, that you do those first. So you sort of use all the clean energy first and only use the dirtier energy as a backup source. So again, this is something they've been experimenting with, and will be interesting to see if they can do this on a large scale. A bunch of other things announced, heavy-duty vehicle emissions, if you've been in China, this is trucks, this very polluting source of emissions, and so something they're going to start regulating. On the international side, sticking points for Paris, where essentially if China and the United States can come to some agreement, I think we have hope for broader agreement, because these are really quite difficult political issues. One is just around what we call transparency. Transparency in data and measurement is actually a very complicated issue, and one that's very important if you're going to start making these pledges. People want to know how do we know you're meeting them? How do we know what your emissions actually look like? Financing is extremely important. So we have created something internationally called the Green Climate Fund. This is based in Korea. It includes pledges made by countries from all over the world, primarily industrialized countries. Although China has made a somewhat surprising announcement to many people that it would fund essentially the same dollar amount as the United States. It essentially met the United States on a dollar per dollar basis, but it put that money into the China South-South Climate Cooperation Fund. So this is a fund that China has helped establish to help support other developing countries in transitioning to low carbon technology. But that's quite significant. This is the largest dollar amount that China has announced that it would put in to this type of support. And then finally, there's also a really interesting discussion happening in the international sort of export financing community about ending financing for coal plants around the world. So this is something that OPEC here in the United States has stopped doing. This is something that, particularly as China is becoming increasingly active in the AIIB, the new Asian Infrastructure Bank, many are wondering, is this going to help build coal plants around the world, export Chinese coal technology, or will it help export Chinese wind technology, solar technology, right? So this will be, I think, very interesting to watch. So what does this all mean for Paris next month? So for those of you who'll be watching this meeting, this starts November 30th. This will be quite interesting. There'll be many heads of state there. I was at a meeting last week with Secretary Kerry, where he said he planned to be on the ground for the entire 2 weeks of the meeting, if necessary, to make sure it goes well, which is not normal. So I think that shows the significance that the U.S. government and other governments are placing on this. I think it's really helpful that we've seen this evolution in the bilateral relationship between China and the United States on climate change, on clean energy, because that wasn't the case just a few years ago. And I think that this, we are much more aligned politically in terms of where both countries are going, and seeing this as a priority issue for domestic implementation, not just for the international community. We've had all these new agreements signed, and I should say, the United States has been signing agreements with all kinds of countries around the world. They've signed new agreements with India, with Mexico, with Brazil. China has signed many agreements with other important countries in the negotiations. So I think both countries are playing an important role in trying to bring others along in this agreement. And you see things showing up in these bilateral agreements that for a long time were just really difficult issues in the negotiations. Things like intellectual property, as I mentioned. And we've seen the bilateral announcements lead to what countries are pledging directly in the UN. So this is, I think, a really important segue from bilateral to multilateral. And all in all, I think this just sets a much better working environment heading into the climate negotiations in Paris, and makes us really much better poised for some sort of successful outcome. We can talk about what that would look like if you're interested. But I think for those of you who remember Copenhagen and the outcome of that meeting, we're in a very different place now, both in the international negotiations, but particularly in the US-China relationship, which I do think is quite determinant of the potential success of the meeting. So I will stop there, and I'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you. Okay, sure, yes. Questions, yes, sir.
Hi. Could you give me a little deeper assessment of the U.S.-China collaboration when it comes to the clean coal technology program? You see anything commercial coming out of it?
Thank you. So the question was, could you speak a bit about clean coal technology cooperation between China and the United States? This has been a big topic of cooperation because both countries still rely on coal for the majority of their energy. However, if you think about climate change and how you can continue to burn coal and deal with climate change, the main technological solution we've come up with is something called carbon capture and sequestration. So the idea here, for those of you who aren't familiar, is that you essentially capture the carbon either before you burn the coal, after you burn the coal, you take it, you sequester it, probably underground in geologic formations. We technically know how to do this, but it's very expensive. And also, if you're running a coal plant and you're also running the carbon capture equipment, you potentially have a 1/3 essentially, a 30+% energy penalty. So you actually burn more coal to get the same amount of electricity if you're also capturing the carbon. I hope I explained that clearly. Anyway, that's been a big focus of cooperation between the two countries, but I think it has been much slower than many people hoped, mostly because of the costs and the sort of technical challenges, which I mentioned. There's a lot of technical interest in this, but not a lot of political interest, and it's very expensive to build the first few demonstration plants. We have a plant here in the United States where this technology is being demonstrated in conjunction with enhanced oil recovery. So if you can actually use the carbon dioxide to help enhance the way at which you're extracting oil from the ground, it makes it more cost effective. So this is something China's doing too. Huaneng has a plant called GreenGen, which is one of the places where this is being demonstrated in China as well. Although again, this is a gasification plant that hasn't moved along as quickly on the carbon capture side as many had hoped. So I think this is still an area that's going to be, be a focus of cooperation. The last presidential summit had some new announcements of projects that they're going to do in this area. But I actually think it's been sort of the biggest challenge in terms of technical cooperation. In the back, yes.
Have lower crude oil prices incentivized or been a break more investments in clean energy?
Great question. So the question was, have lower crude oil prices, how has that affected clean energy development? I would say there's a lot of concern that low oil prices would essentially mean why should we invest in clean energy, right? Because if oil prices are high, we look for alternatives. If oil prices are low, we just sort of stick with status quo. Couple problems, I think, though, with that assumption. One is that in the United States, particularly, most of our oil is going to transportation, right? It's going to gasoline, petroleum. Most of our wind, solar, et cetera, for electricity, right? And we don't have a lot of electric cars yet in the United States. So these don't tend to actually be overlapping sort of substitutes yet. In China, it's a little bit blurrier, but because they are actually starting to do electric vehicles more quickly. But again, I think this is less of an issue for clean energy in the power sector. It could change, and I think the biggest thing that's had an impact is not so much oil prices, although it's linked, is non-conventional gas exploration, oil and gas, so particularly the shale gas, right, we hear about here in the United States, which has really revolutionized the U.S. energy system. And the fact that we have cheap, abundant natural gas in a way that we did not 5 years ago, I think that is what is potentially affecting investment in renewables. I think because you have a lot of states in the U.S. that have pretty aggressive renewable portfolio standards that mandate you actually do a certain share of renewables, we've still seen pretty aggressive growth in wind and solar, for example. And China has not had the same success in domestic shale gas exploration as the United States, although on paper their reserves are potentially much larger than those of the United States. So down the line, if those get developed, that could, I think, be really interesting. But China right now uses a tiny amount of natural gas in their energy system. They need more. And so for China, this wouldn't necessarily be what we call like a bridge fuel in the U.S., but this could be a really important source of energy for the industrial sector, for power, for a variety of uses that would substitute coal. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you for a wonderful and informative lecture. I have a question. Evan Osnos in his book, Age of Ambition, he commented China does everything in a fever fashion. So in your expert opinion, how long those new policies of research and development in energy and clean energy will be sustainable? Can they be reversed after another leader comes to power? I'm just curious.
Yeah, great question. So the question was, are the policies we're seeing, are these sort of short-term policies, if I have it right, fevers, trends, and will they go away in a few years with the next big thing? I think that we've actually seen at this point about 10 to 15 years of sustained focus on clean energy investment in China from the research and development side and from the deployment side. China started really encouraging wind power development in 2002, 2003. So it's been more than 10 years since they put in place the first aggressive policies, and those haven't changed substantially. If anything, they've gotten stronger. And I think that, there, of course, will be shifts, as things evolve. But, I think the air pollution problem is worse now than it was then. I think they understand now that they can play extremely important role globally in manufacturing these technologies and be a real competitor, that this is a source of local economic development. It's not just an environmental policy, it's an economic policy. So I think there's just a lot of reasons why continued clean energy support is actually, it sort of aligns with the broader priorities of the government, which are much bigger than sort of just an passing interest in environmental protection or in clean energy specifically. So I don't think it's going anywhere. And if anything, there'll be new technologies, there'll be new focus, but I would see that staying quite central and maybe getting larger.
And with those clean air effort and development, how long do we think ordinary people can see actually clean air in the cities?
Yeah, so the question is, so how long till the air is clean? Yeah, when will we see results? Well, it's interesting. Air pollution is quite complicated, right? If you reduce one pollutant, you may increase something else because there's very interesting atmospheric chemistry happening, right? And we're actually seeing right now that if you look at the data from 2015 to date, everything is lower than last year and the year before. So pollution is down this year. If you've been in China this year, you may have felt this. I was in China in June, and I actually had 10 blue sky days in a row, which was quite amazing. But that's not a trend, right? Just because I see blue sky days, that doesn't say, oh, all the policies are working. This is a trend, because again, these things go up and down. They go up and down because of the way this depends on broader weather conditions, right? There's a lot of factors here. So we won't know, I think, for a few more years how well these policies are working. But if China really does get serious about restricting the building of new coal plants, affecting vehicle emissions. In cities, the issue tends to be vehicle-related pollution, because at this point, a lot of the factories and power plants have been moved outside the city. So it depends where you are, what the cause is. But they're controlling it sort of in all the right places, and then the question is just how long will it take for the implementation to lead to results? Yeah. Yeah.
I have a R&D question because of putting so much money in research. How about the space solar research? I was very impressed talking to Chinese scientists, developing a space solar, which doesn't have any problem with beaming down to the local areas. So that's a wonderful technology, and also competing with Japan, I think it's that one. And also side effect of the clean energy, like the wind sound issue to the hydro for the environmental issue again. So China is looking at also the side effect of the clean energy.
Yeah. Yeah. So the question is about sort of other models of clean energy, space, solar, and the environmental impacts of wind power and things like this. Yeah, so these are all, I think, issues which are sort of just, well, actually, I can't really speak to the space solar one. I'll be interested to learn from you more about that. I don't follow that as closely. But in terms of the siting of wind and sort of concerns about environmental impact, I think, this is something that there needs to be much more focus on. At the moment, the wind development tends to be far from populations, but that won't last if you do the visions I showed you, right, of very aggressive wind development. In this country, the real challenge to wind development has been offshore development. So, there's a lot of potential here. As I mentioned earlier, if you want to build wind power, you ideally put it near the load, near the people, right, where the demand is. In the U.S., that's essentially the eastern coastline. We don't have a lot of empty space to put huge wind farms, so you don't see very many around here. But off of Massachusetts, off of New Jersey, they're looking at doing these offshore projects. But as you may know, not a single one has been built yet in the United States because they've been tied up in political approval procedures, public opposition to the projects. People don't want to look at them, essentially. And you want to make sure it's not going to affect the ocean environment, affect marine shipping, things like that. China actually has very aggressive targets for offshore wind, partly because they have some coastline that's not being used recreationally as much, is more industrial. But it is still challenging. It's more expensive to do it that way. And so I think that's where you've actually seen the biggest opposition and sort of the slowest progress. Yeah, in the back.
We're talking about these long-term emissions reduction agreements between nations. What is your understanding of what the monitoring mechanisms will be? And what do you foresee that being one of the main topics of discussion in Paris? And I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, great question. So the question is, what will the monitoring mechanisms be for the emissions targets that countries are putting forward in advance of Paris? This is actually going to be a large topic of discussion. It has been already for a few years, but the model we're in now, leading up to Paris, is that countries are coming forward with what we call INDCs. These are their intended nationally determined contributions. So what does that mean? It basically means every country sort of makes up what they are going to do, and they pledge that to the UN, but that they can do it in any metrics, they can say, we're going to do a renewable energy target, or we're going to reduce carbon emissions on an intensity basis, or we're going to reduce our growth rate in emissions off of a baseline, which we've determined is a future counterfactual of what, and so I don't want to get too technical, right, but essentially, if someone agrees to reduce their emissions 40% from business as usual by 2030, what was business as usual, and how do we know if they achieve that or not, and how do we calculate this if their metrics are different from another country? So, long story short, I think the issue of measurement is an extremely important issue, but it's a very political issue because countries are sensitive to essentially having everyone else inspect their emissions data. If you remember back in 2007, it was reported by an international organization that China's emissions had surpassed those of the U.S., the next largest emitter, and we're now the largest in the world. This was back in 2007. That happened many years before even the U.S. Department of Energy sort of expected that would happen. But the first response from the Chinese government was, no, that's not accurate. like that didn't happen, right? And because honestly, like everyone was still trying to figure out what was the right number, like, you know, what are the measurements, and it's very hard to get very accurate data on this. I think one of the most important things that could come out of China's national cap and trade program I referred to would be a robust national measurement system for carbon data for greenhouse gases. Because if you're going to start allocating permits and trading in allowances of carbon, you need to have a really good idea of what's the total amount of allowances, who's emitting what, are you hitting your target, are you below your target, how many permits do you have to buy to meet your target, right? So this has to be verified very carefully. So that they're going to have to put that system in place for that policy to work. And that would have great spillover effects for the climate negotiations. But it's not just China. This is an issue in all countries, you know, particularly countries that are still developing a robust statistical and measuring system. Yeah.
I'm curious to hear your thoughts, Eleanor, your thoughts on how aggressive China's targets are. Specifically, are there areas that you think you were surprised at how aggressive some of their targets were, or were there other areas where you didn't think they were aggressive enough?
So the question is, could I comment on how aggressive China's targets are and which ones are maybe more aggressive than others and where I was surprised? That's a great question. You know, I think that I do think China's targets are aggressive, and I think that, so there's sort of three big energy-related targets which are in the current pledge for Paris. One is the peak year, one is the non-fossil target, and one is the carbon intensity target. You know, in assessing ambition, all you can do is sort of look at these, as I said, business as usual trends and projections and say, is what they're agreeing to maybe more or less robust than what would have happened in the absence of a target, right? And so that's the only way you can really assess how ambitious it is. So if you look at the peak year, I mean, as I said, for a long time, no one actually believed a peak year was in the cards anytime soon. And so the fact that the government publicly said, no, we are going to peak by 2030, maybe earlier, that's a big deal. One issue, though, with that target is they haven't said where they're going to peak. So if you imagine a peak, you can peak here, you can peak here. And in terms of the global climate system and total sort of atmospheric emissions, it really matters, right, where China peaks. So that is sort of yet to be determined and will be very important. A low peak would obviously be preferable from a climate perspective. The non-fossil energy target is I think quite aggressive. You know, there are I showed you a scenario of a much more aggressive vision of the future, but that's a very ambitious and maybe not politically realistic or economically realistic, or it will be technically challenging, I'll put it that way. So you could get there, but it is a really different vision of the power system going forward. So I think, you know, the target China put forward is within the range of sort of more politically realistic studies. And then the carbon intensity target, again, if you look, I did a calculation just looking at what the U.S. Department of Energy had projected for China's carbon intensity, and their target is more aggressive than that, for example. So I'll leave it at that. Yeah.
Is anybody doing any research in the architectural design of the houses so they save money, you know, like for heating and air conditioning and things like that?
Yeah, so the question was, is there any research being done on how you can save energy in the design of buildings and homes? Yes, this is a huge issue in China. As you know, China's building a lot of new buildings, commercial and residential. And so when I mentioned the USChina Clean Energy Research Center, buildings is one of the three pillars of that. And there's been a lot of really interesting inventions and policy sort of models coming out of that. So China is now putting in place pretty aggressive building standards for new buildings. And, you know, there's different ways you can do, you know, more efficient materials. One of the projects that came out of the CERC, it was a sort of a simple technology, but really quite innovative. It's a white roof technology. So it's essentially a roof coating that makes your roof more reflective and makes the entire building cooler. And that's an example of something that Dow and some of the other companies involved and some of the researchers involved had come up with. And they're demonstrating, I believe, that technology and a bunch of other technologies in China. China has been doing, you know, a lot of these sort of demonstration buildings to show state-of-the-art energy efficiency technologies, as well as then implementing them more broadly on general buildings. So again, I think it's really a question of enforcement, making sure for all the new buildings going in that they are sort of the greenest, most energy-saving technology possible, because there's really no reason for them not to at this point. It's really, you save money for the builders. It's an incentive issue. You know, if you're living in an apartment building that you didn't build, you don't care if it's efficient, if you're not paying the heating, and with buildings, it tends to be, you need to incentivize the actual builders to actually put the standards in place so that then that gets passed on to the end users of the building down the line.
Okay. Please join me to thank Dr. Lewis. It was a wonderful talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.